welcome to the second podcast of Call Your Broker. This is Matthew Struck with Treadstone Risk Management. Joining me again are Giovanni Mancini with Treadstone Risk Management and John DiMartino with Liberty Benefit Advisors.
Hey, guys.
Hey, how is everybody?
So what we're going to be talking about today actually kind of puts John on the hot seat a little bit. We're going to be talking about his bailiwick. This episode is about collective bargaining negotiations in New Jersey with respect to health benefits and other benefits that get rolled into that process. The regulatory and legislative environment here in New Jersey for health benefits has been a little chaotic, and there's been a lot of changes, mostly because certain things that were put into place a long time ago are now kind of fully either enacted or falling off. And so the biggest thing is Chapter 78. So Chapter 78 contributions are sunsetting. So my first question, John, is what is Chapter 78, or what are Chapter 78 contributions? And then the follow-up is why is it such a big deal that they're sunsetting?
All right. So Chapter 78, one of the most hotly debated and either loved or hated pieces of legislation probably in New Jersey history with the Christie administration. Actually, prior to the Christie administration, no public sector entity, at least school district-wide in New Jersey, was really contributing towards the cost of their benefits, right? Mm-hmm. So they had Direct 10 benefits, which are the richest benefits money can buy at the time, for free, basically. And times were great.
So you're talking about just the employees or the school districts?
They were contributing something small, right? It was a 1.5% of salary at some places.
Right before Chapter 78 kicked in. That was Chapter 2, which set like a small floor for them to pay for.
Sure.
So it started there and then snowballed into Chapter 78. And the gist of that law was that public sector employees had to contribute towards the cost of their benefits a certain percentage based on what their salary was. So we call that salary banded in the industry. The more money you make, the higher your contribution towards the benefits.
Right. So now, is that a good thing or a bad thing that it's attached to the salary?
Well, it depends on who you ask.
Right.
If you are a high wage earner, you don't like it.
Of course.
But if you're a low wage earner, then you definitely love it. From our standpoint, a consulting standpoint, as it pertains to the Affordable Care Act, right, we had to offer employees benefits that were affordable, and the Chapter 78 grid was offered in such a way that it was always affordable for the employees, at least per their definition.
Sure.
So in that respect, it was good. And the biggest thing was that Chapter 78 has 4 different pieces to it: year 1, 2, 3, and 4. So each year, 1 through 4, the contribution amount that the employee has to pay increases, right? So what ended up happening was, for the most part, collective bargaining units bargain in a 3-year period of time. And this went back and forth for a while, but ultimately, how the law read was that if once you start contributing Chapter 78, so let's say collective bargaining agreement number 1, years 1, 2, and 3, you're contributing Chapter 78 years 1, 2, and 3. And then the next contract that's 3 years, it's 4, 4, 4.
Okay.
So what happens was you were essentially dealing with Chapter 78 for a period of 6 years, even though it only went up to year 4.
Right.
So there's quite a few things that people have done to help mitigate that, but what happens now is really what we're interested in talking about. Now that 6-year period of time is up, Chapter 78 does what's called sunsets. And there was a lot of back and forth on this too, but the gist of it is unions can now bargain with the Board of Education to determine what their contribution is going to be. So it's not subject to state mandates anymore. Some of the issues are, is the money in the budget? Can we roll back to a lower contribution? And those are some of the things that we'll definitely be talking about as this podcast continues.
Okay, so I'm going to approach this kind of from the BA standpoint. If you guys are sitting in front of me and we're talking about going to negotiations, and what's the first thing I want to talk about is the psychology. Is as a BA, I'm not really going to be an overly active participant in the negotiations. Some BAs choose to be a little bit more active. I mean, I'm a little bit more passive when it comes to things like this, especially because the BA has to balance all of these different objectives that are going to take place at the negotiating table. What's kind of the mindset on both sides of the negotiating table in terms of the unions and the employees with respect to how much they have to contribute, and then also on the flip side, the Board of Ed and kind of the considerations that they have?
Right. So taking a look at it first from a perspective of an employee who's part of a collective bargaining unit, I can say pretty freely that there's a lot of resentment there, right? I mean, this wasn't something that was negotiated. This was something that the state unilaterally thrust upon them.
Yep.
So if I'm an employee, every year since Chapter 78 came out, I've taken home less and less money. And as both of you know, medical inflation can be 10% or higher,
Right.
whereas salary increases pre-Chapter 78 were on average about 4%. Post-Chapter 78, they're about 2.5%.
Right. So inflation's essentially outpacing the salary increases that they're seeing for the most part.
Absolutely. In between that high medical inflation and the fact that I'm now taking home less every year, because there was also a law on how much we could raise the taxes, right? 2% cap.
Yep.
I'm very upset if I'm an employee, and I'm looking to roll back my contributions to a level that I deem acceptable.
Sure.
In a perfect world, we'd make them vanish again, right? If I'm a union member, but that's not the world that we live in.
Sure.
Now, stepping back and taking a look at it from the board perspective, Chapter 78's been great. We've had so much more money in the budget, right? And we've been able to do tons of different things, and hopefully the money was used appropriately. What we've seen was some districts have money left in the budget where they can roll back the contributions a little bit willingly, and they're heading into negotiations with that mindset. We have some districts that financially are in a little bit more trouble.
Sure.
And they don't necessarily have the means to roll those back.
Right.
So what I try and look at as a consultant, and what we're starting to look at now, is where the two meet, right? Because believe it or not, we're all sitting on the same side of the table here, right? With help from the board and the employees, we can help offset some of those costs that are driving medical inflation. We can help upset some of those costs that are causing employees to pay an astronomical amount out of their paycheck. And in future years, if we do it right, there's a huge opportunity to put employees and the board in a position where, believe it or not, healthcare costs are somewhat contained.
Right.
So there's also another monkey wrench to throw in here, and keeping my business administrator hat on, there seems to be a lot of rumblings of this every single year. But state employee health benefits plan, if I'm in a district that's in this plan that's run by the state, basically, I've heard rumors about issues in terms of their funding and what's going to happen with the plan and whatnot. That kind of throws a monkey wrench in here as well, doesn't it?
No, definitely. And Matt, this is a year in particular where there's a lot of uncertainty, right? And as a risk manager, is there anything we love more than uncertainty?
You plan for the worst and hope for the best.
So what we're looking at this year is there was a report that was released by KPMG, an accounting firm, which has to review the financials of the SHBP for the munis and the SEHBP for the school boards every year. And what they found were, let me backtrack. Insurance companies need to keep an account on hand of money to pay claims for the year. And they need to keep about 25% of their total spend for the year in this bank account. What we see now is there's about 3% of the amount they're supposed to have in this account. Dangerously low. And I'm ballparking those figures, but you get the gist of it. That's pretty close to what it is actually. So to mitigate that, there's really only two things they can do. Either come out with a big increase to replenish those reserves, or slash the benefits so they don't have to pay out as much money. One of the things that makes this a particularly interesting year is the governor change. Right. So whether we like it or not, politics does play a part in some of this. And the teachers are pushing legislation, and I believe it's passed, that the state now has to fund their pension, which you're probably all very well aware has been extremely underfunded for quite some time, dating back to the 90s.
Yep.
So if there is a perfect storm for the SEHBP, this is what it looks like.
So now that kind of paints a really complex picture here. I mean, the school board's getting it. In terms of probably rate, they're going to get hit with some rate increases for their coverage. But you're also going to have the unions trying to claw back some of these Chapter 78 contributions that the membership have been having to deal with. So when it comes to the negotiating table, I think the old style of doing it, or the way a lot have done it, have been, you kind of sit around the table, everyone orders pizza. It could take, hours and hours, but you sit there and kind of spitball and almost throw darts at a dartboard, right? So the union says, well, ideally we would like it to be this, and the board says, ideally we would like it to be this. And then everyone kind of parts ways. There's no real resolution, and everyone kind of agrees to say, okay, we know where you're at, we know where we're at. We're going to go back to our, our office or whatnot, and kind of crunch the numbers and see what this looks like if we were to give a little or you gave a little. What can be done to kind of, we're young guys. We're in the world of trying to make things more efficient, right? We're trying to make things a little bit more streamlined, and trying to help our clients out. What's a way that we could really kind of sit around the negotiating table and maybe trim the fat on this process and really kind of get down to maybe getting a resolution here?
No, definitely, and I think that goes back to where we started, where we see things just a little bit differently than everybody else. So when I got into the industry, Chapter 78 had just passed. So what does that mean for me? I've been a part of, I can't even tell you how many negotiations, but I've never seen them done the way they were done before, where the union just says no, and that's pretty much that. Every year I've been a part of these negotiations, we've seen incremental changes, right? So whether it's Chapter 78, or if you're in a private plan, tweaking that plan just a little bit to get some rate relief. They've been pretty much on the same side. Now, I can't say universally, the board and the union are always on the same side.
Sure.
But we've seen a lot more like negotiation, right? The actual negotiation, where we're working towards a common goal. And I think now more than ever, we're starting to see more of that. But there's a lot that has to be done. So I'm going to have Giovanni in just a minute tell us a little bit about a current or a recent negotiation that we were a part of, and kind of some of the things that we did differently that helped facilitate it. But ultimately, employees and especially the union leaders need to be educated on what it is we're doing. They need a background on how the marketplace works, because it's not just you get your 10% increase and you move on. There are ways to mitigate that. But it can't come from me. It can't come from the board. It has to be grassroots. It has to come from the union. So there are certainly ways where we can kind of get that down. Now going back to that, again, I look at it and I serve at the privilege of the board. There's not two ways about that. But I make it very clear that I try and stay as independent as possible and create strategies that help both sides. Because that's ultimately what the point of a negotiation is.
Well, if you always just fall on the side of the board and you end up, rubbing the union the wrong way, that's now made everyone else's job in the administration more difficult. And so, to your point, it makes more sense for you to work on either side of the table, and even on the property and casualty and risk management side for Gio and I to work on both sides of the table, because if you've got the cure for cancer, but it causes a lot of adversity, it's never going to be successful, right? So, Gio, really quickly, you've really seen this in action, right?
Yes.
You've been involved in some recent negotiations. How did those go?
So part of what made us successful at these most recent negotiations that we had is our commitment to educating the people that we're talking to from the immediate moment that we get into that room. And we find that is where we can really build off of immediate successes and breakthroughs in them understanding what we're talking about, because it's complex information that we're really throwing to them in a condensed amount of time. Some of my clients on the property and casualty side, it's taken me, a couple go-rounds and renewal cycles to have them understand kind of where I'm coming from as far as the theory behind why we place the insurance a certain way, what kinds that we go out and buy, and some of the constant risk management protocols that we will put in place. So on the negotiation side, what we found that if we immediately walked in the door and we said, all right, hey, we can find a happy medium between the union negotiations and the board negotiations. There's a place to be where you're simply advising on the current status of the environment inside of the health benefits world and where we can be and what the differences are between the 2 or 3 or 4 options that we're going to offer. The most recent 2 boards that we were out to the last couple weeks, we met immediate opposition from the union, and most of it was from uncertainty. And it's an inherent issue that I think people will have if they don't know exactly what's going on. They're hesitant to make any change. I call it the devil you know versus the devil you don't. You always side with it. Even if you're not happy with it, you side with what you know until you're fully vested or understanding in what the new process is going to be. So we walk into both these negotiations with immediate opposition, as I said, and by the end of it, and I'll give you the quick end of it, they both end incredibly positively. The decisions that were ultimately made were recommendations of ours, of course, but they were made with essentially unanimous support by the union, which is not usually the case. Usually the board is going to make a unilateral change. Their collective bargain agreement will say that they have to provide, state health benefits plan or equivalent. Or equal to, essentially. So we're able to then say to them, all right, this is the only part that the union doesn't really have control over, that change, but we want to include you in the process so that it's something that runs a bit more seamless, because everyone, instead of being angry over the change, is at least willing to understand what's going to be going on. So we were able to make pretty drastic changes in both of these instances. One, changing the carrier, going from the state health benefits plan to a self-insured pooled arrangement, and then the other one, staying with the state health benefits plan, but drastically changing the base plan offering. And if you had told them when we first walked in the room that the outcome would have been what it ended up being, I'm sure that they wouldn't have believed us. But over that few hour process where John and I were in that meeting, we educated them to the point where we individually spent the time with each person to explain, hey, I know there's a pain point here, and we're going to find it, and we're going to essentially quell that concern by providing you the information you're looking for. You want to know. Of course, you're here for your constituency, for the union, for the people that you represent, but you're also concerned about what it means for you. Changes to these benefit plan designs typically are favored by a large majority of it as far as what it impacts people financially. But there's a few that don't. And how do we get to the point to educate them to how they can fill those gaps? And John will talk about it a little bit more in detail, but how do we fill those gaps, or how do we educate them about how they can set themselves up for them to no longer really be gaps where they can fund them in advance?
Right. And it's funny, when we first walked into the meeting with the board prior to seeing the union, we actually laughed, right? Because we were taking a look at a strategic decision that had never been done in New Jersey before. And universally, we kind of said, I don't know if they're going to go for this, guys. I mean, there's almost no way that they're going to go for this, because they don't understand it and they don't understand how it'll benefit them. And it was really our goal at that meeting to try and educate them and say, like, this is good for you. You come out a winner 9.9 times out of 10 if you choose this strategy. So it's just funny looking back on it. We started with the mindset that everybody else has, but then we were able to overcome that by really working as a true consultant. And I think that's where there was a big difference. We didn't look at it as a broker, which says, we'll shop the plans and give you the results. We really worked to educate all the parties involved to let them know exactly what they needed to know in order to determine whether or not it was a good decision for them.
So now, do you have any special tools or anything like that you use in this process to help with that education and understanding kind of some of the ramifications of the trade-off?
Definitely. So one of the biggest assets that we bring to the table is what I refer to as the budget modeling tool. And that was a tool I built a few years ago and really refined over the past 6 months. And what it allows us to do is we load all the employee information into this tool, and then in real time we can project what the impact is going to be on every single person and on the board as a whole if we change the salary guide. So if we go from 2.5 to 3%, if we change Chapter 78 contributions from year 4 to year 1. I actually created it in such a way that we can create custom contributions. So we can have up to 20 of those added. And then we can also change the base plan, right, from Direct 10 to 2035 and anything in between. Right, we can make it a high deductible health plan if they wanted to. We can also add in HRA fees. I mean, there's an unlimited number of things that we can do with this. The reason why that has proved so great in the last few negotiations we've used it in is because typically they're spreadsheeting these things by hand, and the Chapter 78 grid is a literal nightmare to spreadsheet by hand. So this changes everything automatically using a few different formulas and tools. So what would have taken 2 to 3 weeks now takes us about 5 seconds to do.
And a real life example in it, we were sitting in negotiations, and we had the idea of what their original proposal was going to be to the union, different plan designs or contributions, and immediately a quick rebuttal had come in at contributions at certain percentage levels, whether it be 5, 6, 7, 8% of salary at a defined number for depending on what part of the salary guide you were on. But we had not received that information prior to us even coming to that negotiations meeting. And there was, the business administrator had looked over and said, they didn't get this. They're not going to be able to pull off the numbers for us. And it took John about 25 seconds to change that contribution number to give them a complete understanding of exactly what that meant for them. And it was actually not good for the board. I think the board ended up losing out in the second year on that circumstance, and I don't think it even benefited the employees in the way that they thought that it might have. So we were able to quickly turn that around, and that's usually, and the podcast will never do it justice, but the tool itself is met with such acceptance. The business administrators that we deal with, they'll see it, and it's almost like their eyes light up because it's made a part of their job easier, and that's really what our job is ultimately down to the nitty gritty. We're looking to provide either expertise where it might not be there, or we're looking to take off some of their daily job or some of what they have to do that they didn't realize that they never had to provide if they had somebody there that was able to provide that type of service to them. And that's where we find value and where we're able to provide it to them. And our business administrators, for the most part, love the tool itself.
Right. So that's probably primarily the tool that we use to help the boards, right? And it's to help the union too, because they counter with their offers, and we can model that in seconds too, and we can see, who's the winner, who's the loser. And what we try and do is find a scenario where both sides come out a winner, right? And that's ultimately what we did at the negotiation we're talking about. So one of the other tools that we use, and this is more for employees. So once we've figured out a strategy that we think works for both sides, right? We have to educate the employees, right? And we call this our total cost estimator. I know it's not a very flashy title, but it tells exactly what it is. Employees don't necessarily think about total cost, the amount that comes out of their paycheck and the amount that comes out of their pocket when they go see a doctor, right? So, if we propose to change from direct 10 to direct 15, someone would slam their fist and say, that's a 150% increase in the copay, right? And yeah, I guess technically you're right, but are you saving any money out of your paycheck, right, to cover that extra $5 of copay? So what we did is we used the Affordable Care Act guidelines for a low, medium, and high risk utilizer of the insurance, and then we model it. So we take what their contribution would be to Direct 10 year 4, and we model that against whatever we're proposing, right? So maybe it's year 1 2030 plan, and then we show them how much money they're saving in each paycheck, and based on their utilization, how much they would expect to spend at the point of sale for the doctor.
Sure.
And then we can come up with a total of how much money they're either gaining or losing. And if we do it right, 9.9 times out of 10, employees come out winners, where they may be taking home, a single person, $500 to $1,000 more bucks a year, all the way up through, I think we saw like $5,000 or $6,000 for somebody.
Right. And interestingly enough, sometimes when we talk like this, and this is an issue all throughout the insurance industry, is I say these types of things to either people that are on the board side or they're on the union side, and sometimes I just don't see it click, and I worry that because it didn't click there, that they kind of just bypassed it and now went on to their next point. And sometimes we reel it back and we provide an example that is a bit more easier to understand. I liken it to a baseball game. If I told you that you had 10 tickets to go see your favorite baseball team this year, and I said this was the total cost to go see it, you in your mind immediately know, well, that's not really the total cost. I'm going to have to pay for parking. I've got food and drink that I'm going to have to get there. So you already in your mind said, all right, these $40 tickets have already turned really to $80 because I'm going to have all these extra expenses. But what if I told you that all of that was included inside of the purchase of the ticket? You would then say to yourself, okay, I can figure out which one makes more sense depending upon what our usage is while we're inside. How many cars we have coming to the game, how many, food and drink purchases we're going to have. And people can easily make that distinction. They could say to themselves, all right, well, the all-in kind of seems like a better idea if I use it. But if nobody in my family feels like eating or drinking while they're at the game, maybe it doesn't make sense. So if you can equate it to that and use those types of examples, people quickly will pick up on that. And that's part of our education, our education piece. That our value proposition includes making those complex comparisons become a bit easier to understand. And it's as simple sometimes as just doing that.
I always tell people that on our business cards, it shouldn't say broker or whatever else our title is. It should really say, educator or something like that, because, we don't teach math or science or anything like that, but we teach insurance and, some of these trade-offs and things. That reminds me in a later podcast, we'll probably have to talk about the total cost of risk on the property casualty side. But so to go back into it, with the forecasting tool, I'm going to kind of take my BA hat off a little bit here, just because I know a little bit of the inner works here. There's usually some behavioral changes, right, that work into some of these. The different plans don't exactly cover an ER visit the same way that they would, one of the other options. So what does the calculator or the forecasting tool do to help you kind of communicate those simple little changes, as opposed to going to the ER, go to the fast ER or the first care kind of place?
So that's part of the education piece, right? Mm-hmm. So for example, if you're looking at changing from Direct 10 to 2035, and that's an extreme example, but you go from a $25 ER copay to a $300 ER copay, right? So maybe in the way we've structured it, we tell you, even if you go to the ER several times, you're still going to save money total cost-wise. You still just straight up may not be comfortable with that $300 spent.
But wait, there's more.
But wait, there's more. So for that person, there's a couple different options. Number one, it's, do you know what an urgent care center is? Two, do you know what telemedicine is? And three, do you know when it's appropriate to go to your primary care physician? So when we take a look at claims experience for a lot of these different groups, we see an overutilization of the emergency room, right? And if we step back and take a look nationally, typically 70% of the things that get taken into an ER could have been avoided by just going to the primary care physician.
Right, non-life threatening, first aid. Yet.
Exactly. So we would never tell somebody not to go to the emergency room,
sure.
But we would educate you on when it is and when it isn't appropriate, and then provide you with alternatives. Right, so if you break your hand and it's a fracture that's not through the skin, right? It's just a little tiny fracture. You go to the urgent care center, right? They're going to X-ray it, they're going to take a look at it, and they're going to ship you off to go get a cast. I mean, it'll be a simple process. Plus, you're not waiting in an emergency room, right, for 6 hours, because you're not emergent, right? Or same situation. You go see your primary care physician. He gives you a script to go get an X-ray, and then you go see a specialist. I mean, that works equally as well. Or you could skip both of those and go right to the specialist, right? In most of these plans. So letting them know what is and isn't emergent, for example, is a great way to go. And also tacking on things like telemedicine, right? It's you can literally FaceTime a doctor, show him the rash on your arm, and if it needs an antibiotic, he can prescribe it, or she, over the phone, and you can go pick it up at the pharmacy.
Wow.
And that's 24/7 for most of these. Some of them are a $20 copay. Some of them are just included in the price of whatever the employer is paying for you.
Sure.
So a huge advantage there.
And I think what also gets missed in that also is, not that I'm shilling for a big company or anything, but, like Walgreens, CVS, they all offer consultation at the desk too. So a lot of these minor things, you might not even have to go to the fast ER or something like that. You could probably just go to the desk at the
That's an education piece. And that's really what we're looking for, because when it really comes down to it, we're not attempting to reinvent the wheel here. We just have to change consumer behavior within your healthcare purchases by a little bit. I mean, the difference between being in a group that has the experience to get out of the state health benefits plan or one that has to stay in because it's too poor is sometimes just a few consumer-driven decisions that people make when they purchase their healthcare or they utilize their healthcare We have to change maybe 1 or 2 of those out of every 10. And if we're able to do that, that makes enough difference where you now have options as a board when you're going to negotiate and you're going out to shop the market for your health insurance premiums, because it's a big spend, right? We're talking 15 to 20% of your entire budget is spent on all the employee benefits that
It's usually
you're
what
gonna
the
be
second or
providing.
third
It's
second or third
enormous.
biggest line item.
And it's enormous, and because of that, it's outside of salaries. You know that they're not taking a decrease on salaries when you're there negotiating. So sometimes the only way to free up that total cost that a board might spend on their employees is really that health insurance line, and that change in consumer philosophy and the way that they go about purchasing and utilizing their healthcare is tweaked just with education. We sat in that most recent negotiations table, and just to tell people that the cost of going for a sprain at the emergency room was 5 times as much going to the urgent care, it was a shocking number to them. They just didn't ever either hear that, or they never put it in dollar cents what that will ultimately do, because the union itself, you really are banding together here. If you all are utilizing the healthcare constantly, I hope that we're all healthy, but we're going to have to pay for that at some point. So there's only so much money in this entire pot. And if we're able to then tell them, and they're able to go back to their constituency and tell them about some of our spending habits and where we can improve it, just being able to communicate that piece is something that hadn't been going on at most places for the most recent past and probably into the future. Everyone we go into, it seems like that's something new that we've been bringing to the table and something that they find valuable, just that small education piece there.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of round out the negotiations conversation, we always focus on the medical and the RX, right? We virtually never talk about anything else. But we need to take a broader look at the employee benefits program. If we're going from a Direct 10 to a 2030 plan, and somebody wants to buy up to the Direct 10 benefits, maybe they just do that by literally buying up. Maybe they buy some voluntary products to help pad it and give them even better coverage, right? So an accident policy, if the kids are always at the ER because they're breaking bones and beating each other up, that can cost a few bucks a paycheck, right? But people aren't aware of that, right? Because the Aflac rep or the Colonial rep comes in once a year. You're kind of not really sure why they're there. But when you include that as part of the total package and part of the medical and RX presentation as well, it makes a lot more sense.
Sure.
And what we're seeing now is more employers taking a look at that and also taking a look at health reimbursement accounts, right? And that's a topic for another day. But the gist of it is, if you use these tools in the right way, you can provide, in some cases, better than benefits for a lower than cost.
Right.
And that's really what your consultant's job is. If your consultant's slapping a few bids on the table and letting you have at it, that's not what we get paid to do, especially now more than ever. Before Chapter 78, that's really all we could do. But now you need somebody who's going to create a strategy for you and your employees to help bend this cost curve. Because what we're facing right now, with a pension plan that's beat up, a state employee health benefits program that's beat up, and medical inflation that just never seems to go down.
Right.
I mean, somebody has to start taking the reins and assume responsibility for these things, and that's what we're trying to do.
And so, sounds like a very holistic approach, which is refreshing. I think is much needed. So the last thing specifically that I wanted to ask you about, John, on this topic was you had mentioned it before. I'm not going to ask you to kind of divulge the recipe for the special sauce here, but rotating back to Chapter 78, we had talked really briefly about some of the implications with long-term disability and the fact that this is kind of almost like buried treasure that some of the districts don't understand. Do you have anything that you could add to that conversation?
No, definitely. Let's take a step back. Typically, if you're part of the union in one capacity or another, you get offered short-term disability and long-term disability through Prudential, right? And they offer a great product. Chapter 78 put into play a long-term disability program as well. So how that impacts your staff, we found that virtually no one is even aware that law exists, number one, and then how to work around it, number two. So we've met with multiple districts that are spending more money than they need to, either on long-term disability or their employees have dual coverage, which it was great in the medical world to have all the coverage you can buy, but in the long-term disability world, it doesn't quite stack like that.
Sure.
So in several of these instances, they're spending money on policies they don't need. So we take a look at that, and then we work with the team to rearrange it in such a way that we're maximizing the dollars that are used.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, whenever it comes to public money, I mean, if it's being if it's being burned when it doesn't need to be burned, if they're paying twice or something,
Right.
I think that's a sticking point for a lot of people. Not just the taxpayers. I mean, especially the taxpayers, but anyone who's also working in those districts or working for those districts as a professional. So
We found it to be basically a bit of an olive branch as well that we're able to offer. Sometimes there's concern about who the insurance broker works for, and the union will be a bit apprehensive as a result of it. But we found that if that's one of the ways that we can get in to discuss with them and then provide some value with some savings or highlighting parts where they have duplicate coverage and something that they can get rid of that adds some money back to their paycheck, it allows us, when we finally get to that table, for them to remember, hey, those guys have already helped us when we hadn't in the past. We didn't have anybody there to assist us. And we find that softens a bit of the concern that they might have about any changes to benefits, because they have built a little bit of trust to begin with, that we at least at the minimum know what we're talking about. We've provided some examples of ways that prove our concept that we're sitting here talking about.
So we covered a lot. I think we're running at about 35 minutes here.
Sure.
So really quickly, if anyone listening to this podcast does have any questions, how do they get in touch with you guys? So I'll start off with John, who's the health guy. What are the different ways that they can find your contact information?
Sure. So they can go right to our website. It's LB as in boy, ANJ.com, so Liberty Benefit Advisors, NJ.com. All of our contact information is up there. If they want to contact me directly, it's first initial, last name, J. DiMartino, DiMartino, at lbanj.com. Alternatively, they can reach me on my work line, 267-467-5224. And of course, all this information is typically posted below in the comments as well.
Of course.
And Gio?
Yeah, so Treadstone Risk Management, you can find us at www.treadstonerisk.com. My direct line is 862-377-9982. And my email address, first initial, last name, gmancini at treadstonerisk.com. And, all of our contact information for Matt and myself is on the website. And we'd love to work for any of you in the future. And we appreciate you guys listening.
Yep, and don't be afraid to give us a call if you just want to bounce some questions off of us or help us demystify something else that you're up against.
Yeah, our goal is to use some of the questions that we get in subsequent podcast episodes. So anything that comes up that we find did help solve a problem for either one of our clients or a prospect or somebody that we've known for some time, we'd love to be able to share that success story on our subsequent episodes. So thank you.
Yep, thank you very much. And remember, call your broker.
Thanks.